"What do you mean you served?" the waitress scoffed, not bothering to lower her voice as she refilled James Harrington's coffee cup. The 68-year-old veteran's weathered hands trembled slightly. His simple request for a military discount met with undisguised skepticism. His faded Vietnam service cap and the barely visible Purple Heart pin on his worn jacket collar were apparently insufficient proof for the young woman, who clearly thought he was just another old man trying to save $2 on a meal. Then, a tall woman in a crisp Air Force uniform walked through the door, her silver eagles gleaming on her shoulders, her eyes immediately locking onto James's humble display of service. The colonel froze, her expression shifting from surprise to something that made the waitress suddenly feel very, very small. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." James Harrington preferred quiet corners and minimal attention, not from timidity, but from decades of learned self-preservation and a bone-deep weariness that had settled in his soul. His modest apartment in the outskirts of Riverdale was a sanctuary of solitude. Walls adorned with fading photographs and bookshelves lined with dog-eared history volumes that few visitors ever saw. He lived frugally on his military pension, supplemented by occasional carpentry jobs that his arthritis increasingly made difficult. Most mornings found him at the Sunshine Diner, a small establishment where he could nurse a single cup of coffee for an hour while reading the morning paper. The owners, an elderly couple who had run the place for 30 years, knew him well enough to offer a respectful nod but little conversation, exactly how James preferred it. Today, however, the owners were away, leaving their granddaughter Tiffany in charge, a 20-something with bright pink highlights and an attitude that made James wince inwardly when he entered. James had served honorably in Vietnam, specifically with the 5th Special Forces Group, the legendary Green Berets. He'd been among the most elite soldiers of his generation, operating deep behind enemy lines on missions that required extraordinary courage and unflinching resolve. The quiet man in the corner booth had once been Lieutenant James Harrington, a young officer whose leadership had saved his entire team during an ambush near the Cambodian border in 1971. The citation for his Silver Star, locked away in a box under his bed, told a story of heroism that he never spoke about. The Purple Heart he occasionally pinned to his jacket was earned when he took shrapnel protecting a wounded comrade, a physical wound that healed far faster than the invisible ones he carried home. After Vietnam, he had continued serving, moving to intelligence operations during the Cold War, gathering information in places where American soldiers officially never set foot. But that was another lifetime. Now he was just an aging veteran whose nightmares still woke him at 3 a.m., whose service had faded from public memory along with the war that had shaped his generation. He had learned to live with the indifference of a nation that preferred to forget the complexity and pain of Vietnam, to look past the sidelong glances of those who, upon learning of his service, wondered what atrocities he might have committed rather than what sacrifices he had made. Today was different from his usual routine. His nephew Michael was graduating from basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in 2 days, and James had scraped together enough for a bus ticket to San Antonio. The Sunshine Diner was his last stop before the long journey, a chance to enjoy a decent meal before 20 hours on a Greyhound. "Could I get the breakfast special, please?" he asked quietly when Tiffany finally deigned to take his order, her attention clearly more focused on her phone than on her customer. "And if you don't mind, I believe you offer a military discount." He gestured almost apologetically to the Vietnam veteran cap beside him on the table. Tiffany's eyes flicked up from her screen, scanning him with poorly disguised skepticism. "You need a military ID for that," she said flatly. "We can't just give discounts to everyone who wears a hat." James felt his cheeks flush slightly, embarrassed at being questioned, but too dignified to argue. "I understand. Just the breakfast special then, please." As she walked away, he heard her mutter to another server, "Yeah, right?" Like he was really in Vietnam, probably bought the hat at a yard sale. The words stung more than they should have, but James merely opened his newspaper and pretended not to hear. When Tiffany returned with his food, she placed it on the table. With barely concealed impatience, "Anything else?" she asked, already turning away. "Just a refill on the coffee when you have a moment," James replied softly. "Sure," she said, rolling her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. "Our hero needs more coffee." James ate his meal in silence, the food tasteless despite the diner's usual good quality. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Vietnam veterans often existed in a strange limbo, neither welcomed home as heroes like the World War II generation, nor embraced with the reflexive "thank you for your service" that modern veterans received. They were the forgotten warriors of an unpopular conflict, their sacrifices overshadowed by the controversy of the war itself. The bell above the diner door chimed, and James glanced up out of habit, assessing the newcomer with the ingrained vigilance that decades of intelligence work had instilled. Colonel Eleanor Ellie Mitchell entered, her Air Force uniform immaculate, her bearing straight but not stiff, the natural posture of someone comfortable with authority but not defined by it. At 45, she had the confidence of a woman who had broken numerous barriers in her 23-year military career. Colonel Mitchell had commanded air operations during the early days of Afghanistan, led humanitarian missions in Somalia, and now served as the director of special programs at the nearby Peterson Space Force Base. What few knew was that she had also been instrumental in developing the Air Force's modern special reconnaissance protocols, building on foundations laid by men like James Harrington decades earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She chose a booth near the entrance, removing her service cap and placing it precisely on the seat beside her. As Tiffany approached with performative enthusiasm, clearly reserved for customers she deemed important, the colonel's eyes swept the diner in the habitual situational awareness that marked career military personnel. That's when she noticed the Vietnam veteran cap on James's table, and more importantly, the small purple heart pin partially hidden by his jacket collar. Something about the way the older man sat, alert despite his age, his back to the wall with a clear view of both exits, triggered her professional recognition. This wasn't just any veteran. This was someone who had operated in the shadows, someone trained to observe without being observed. As Tiffany took the colonel's order with newfound attentiveness, Colonel Mitchell continued studying James from the corner of her eye. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, not as someone she had met, but as someone whose work she had studied. During her advanced officer training, she had analyzed historical special operations, including classified missions from the Vietnam era, that had established precedents still followed today. James, feeling her gaze, met her eyes briefly before returning to his newspaper. That fleeting eye contact, professional and assessing, was enough for Colonel Mitchell to make her decision. After Tiffany departed with her order, the colonel rose and approached James's table. "Excuse me, sir," she said, standing at a respectful distance. "I couldn't help noticing your cap. Vietnam?" James nodded cautiously. "Yes, ma'am. Long time ago now. May I?" She gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Of course, Colonel," he replied, noting her rank with the quick precision of someone who still remembered every insignia and what it signified. She sat down, extending her hand. "Colonel Eleanor Mitchell, United States Air Force." "James Harrington," he replied, his handshake firm despite his age. "5th Special Forces Group, if I'm not mistaken," she said quietly, nodding toward a nearly invisible emblem on his weathered jacket. James couldn't hide his surprise. Few people, even within the military, would recognize the subtle indicator of his unit. "That's correct," he acknowledged, his voice dropping slightly. "How did you know?" Colonel Mitchell smiled. "The way you sit, for one thing. Back to the wall, eyes on the exits. Old habits from operating in hostile territory. But mostly I recognized your name." She leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant James Harrington, Silver Star recipient. Operation Tailwind, 1971. Your mission protocols are still taught at the Air Force Special Operations School as foundational doctrine." James stared at her, genuinely stunned. His operations had been classified for decades, with only portions declassified in the late 1990s. The idea that his work had not only been remembered, but was being taught to new generations of operators, had never occurred to him. "They teach about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, your team's extraction methodology under duress is literally Chapter 3 in our advanced field manual," Colonel Mitchell replied with undisguised respect. "What you accomplished with the equipment available at that time was nothing short of miraculous. We have satellite communications and GPS now, but the principles you established for maintaining operational security during exfiltration haven't changed." Tiffany approached with the Colonel's coffee, her eyes widening slightly at finding her at James's table. "Can I get you anything else, Colonel?" she asked, pointedly ignoring James. "Yes," Colonel Mitchell replied, her tone professional but with an edge that made Tiffany stand straighter. "You can bring Mr. Harrington a fresh cup of coffee, and I'd appreciate it if you'd treat him with the respect his service deserves. Lieutenant, Harrington's actions saved the lives of 14 American servicemen and helped establish protocols that protect our special operators to this day." Tiffany blinked, looking between the Colonel and James with confusion. Of course. Right away," she stammered, hurrying away. James felt a mixture of embarrassment and something long forgotten, pride. "That wasn't necessary, Colonel," he said quietly. "With respect, sir, it absolutely was," Colonel Mitchell replied firmly. "Your generation of warriors laid the foundation for everything we do today. The institutional knowledge you developed through blood and sacrifice is irreplaceable." When I realized who you were, she shook her head slightly. "It's like finding out I'm having coffee with a living legend for the first time in years." James felt seen, not as an aging relic of a controversial war, but as a professional whose contributions mattered. The feeling was so unexpected, so foreign after decades of practiced invisibility, that he found himself momentarily at a loss for words. Tiffany returned with fresh coffee for both of them, her earlier attitude replaced by awkward deference. "I'm sorry about before," she said to James, her cheeks flushed. "I didn't realize." "It's all right," James interrupted gently. "You couldn't have known." As Tiffany retreated, Colonel Mitchell sipped her coffee. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings you out today? I get the impression this is a deviation from your usual routine." James smiled faintly. "My nephew Michael is graduating from basic training at Lackland, taking the bus down tomorrow." "Lackland?" Colonel Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a coincidence. I'm flying down tomorrow morning for a conference at Joint Base San Antonio, right next to Lackland. The graduation ceremony is for the 326th Training Squadron, correct?" James nodded. Surprised again. "I'm scheduled to be a guest speaker at that very graduation," she said, her eyes brightening. "Your nephew is in excellent company. This class has broken several training records." She paused, studying him for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Harrington, I'd be honored if you would consider flying down with me instead of taking the bus. The Air Force maintains a small executive transport fleet for official business, and I have authorization for passengers related to my duties. Given your contributions to Special Operations Doctrine, I could easily justify your presence as a historical consultant." James blinked in surprise. "That's incredibly generous, Colonel, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not generosity, sir, it's professional courtesy," she replied firmly. "Besides, I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss your experiences. There are aspects of your operations that, even now that they've been declassified, aren't fully documented. The institutional knowledge you carry is invaluable." James hesitated, his weathered hands clasping the coffee mug as he processed the Colonel's unexpected offer. For decades, he had worked to blend into the background, to be forgettable. The idea of suddenly stepping into the light, of acknowledging his past service so publicly, stirred a complex mixture of emotions. Behind his measured expression, memories surfaced, some he had spent years trying to forget, others he had clung to during the darkest nights. "I appreciate the offer more than I can express, Colonel Mitchell," he finally said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "But I've spent a long time staying out of the spotlight. It becomes a habit, I suppose." Colonel Mitchell nodded. with understanding. The transition from operational security to civilian life isn't just about changing clothes, is it? It becomes part of who you are. She gestured toward the diner window, where life continued its ordinary pace. Most people out there will never understand what it means to carry the weight of classified operations, to know things you can never speak about, to have done things that can never appear in history books. James studied her face, recognizing the sincerity in her expression. There was something refreshing about speaking with someone who understood the unspoken burdens of service without requiring explanation. You've seen your share of that burden too, I suspect. Different era, different conflicts. But yes, she acknowledged, though I've had advantages your generation never did. Better support systems, more recognition, certainly more acceptance. As a woman in uniform, she paused, choosing her next words carefully. Mr. Harrington, I understand your reluctance, but your nephew is entering a military that exists because of foundations your generation built. There's value in him seeing the connection between his future service and your past contributions. As they spoke, the diner's morning rush began in earnest. Tiffany, now moving with careful attentiveness around their table, brought a fresh pot of coffee without being asked. James noticed her lingering, clearly eavesdropping on their conversation with poorly disguised curiosity. Is there something else, Tiffany? Colonel Mitchell asked, her tone professional but not unkind. The young waitress flushed slightly. My manager just called. He said if you're who he thinks you are. She gestured to James. Then your meal is on the house. He said to tell you that his father served in the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam. James looked surprised. Dan's father was in the 173rd. I had no idea. He never mentioned it. Colonel Mitchell asked. We don't talk about it much. James replied simply. Most of us don't. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably. I'm really sorry about before. My grandfather was in Vietnam too, but he never talks about it either. She trailed off, unsure how to continue. It's all right, James assured her. Vietnam was complicated. A lot of people came home to a country that didn't know how to welcome them back. Colonel Mitchell observed the interaction with interest. That's one of the greatest disservices our nation has ever done to its warriors, she said, creating a culture where veterans felt they needed to hide their service rather than being honored for it. James nodded, a lifetime of experiences reflected in his eyes. It's different now. Better in many ways. I see how people treat you in uniform, Colonel. That's progress worth acknowledging. Progress built on lessons learned from how your generation was treated, she replied, which is why preserving your stories matters so much. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 young airmen in their service uniforms. Clearly just off duty from the nearby base, they chose a table across the diner, their voices carrying with the exuberance of youth as they joked and settled in. One of them, a tall young man with staff sergeant stripes, glanced over at Colonel Mitchell, immediately straightening in his seat and nudging his companions. Attention on deck, he said quietly but firmly, and all 3 airmen rose to their feet. Standing at attention, as you were, Colonel Mitchell called over with a small smile. Enjoy your breakfast, gentlemen. The airmen relaxed slightly, but remained standing. Thank you, Mum, the staff sergeant replied. If you don't mind my asking, are you Colonel Mitchell from Peterson? I am, she confirmed. The young man's face lit up with recognition. Ma'am, I was at the Kandahar evacuation in 2021. You coordinated the air support that kept our perimeter secure. It's an honor to see you again. Colonel Mitchell nodded in acknowledgement. The honor was serving alongside dedicated airmen like yourselves, Sergeant. Please, sit and enjoy your meal. The airmen returned to their seats, but their attention remained focused on the colonel's table, their expressions a mixture of respect and curiosity about the older man. Sharing her table, James noticed their glances, but kept his eyes down, the instinct to remain unnoticed still strong after all these years. Your fan club seems interested. He commented quietly to Colonel Mitchell. She smiled slightly. They're more interested in you. I suspect military personnel can spot one of their own, especially someone with your background. Your bearing gives you away to those who know what to look for. As if confirming her words, The staff sergeant approached their table after a few minutes, standing at a respectful distance. "Excuse me, Colonel, I don't mean to interrupt your conversation." "Not at all, Sergeant Cooper," she replied, reading his nameplate. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, ma'am," the young airman said, his eyes shifting to James, "I wanted to ask if the gentleman with you served with 5th Group in Vietnam." When James looked up in surprise, the sergeant continued, "My grandfather was with 5th Group, 1969 to 1972. He rarely talks about it, but he has a photo of his team on his wall. And I noticed the same pin on your jacket, sir." James found himself momentarily speechless. Yes, he finally managed. "I was with the 5th. What was your grandfather's name?" "Master Sergeant Thomas Cooper, sir." James's expression transformed, decades falling away as recognition dawned. "Tommy Cooper, radio specialist from Kentucky?" The young airman's face broke into an astonished smile. "Yes, sir, that's him, son. Your grandfather saved my life at Plymouth in '71, James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Best radio man in the entire group. Could call in an airstrike in the middle of a firefight without missing a beat." Staff Sergeant Cooper stared at James, visibly processing this unexpected connection to his family's history. "Sir, my grandfather never talks about what happened over there when I joined the Air Force. He just told me to always keep my head down and watch out for my team. Sound advice." James nodded. "Your grandfather was a good man. Is he still?" "Yes, sir. Lives in Colorado Springs now. Retired from the Postal Service about 10 years ago." James shook his head in wonder. "Tommy Cooper. I haven't seen him since '72. Colonel Mitchell, watching this exchange with interest, spoke up. "Sergeant Cooper, how long until your grandfather could get here?" The young airman checked his watch. "Maybe 30 minutes, ma'am. He's probably just finishing his morning walk." "Call him," she said decisively. "Tell him an old friend from 5th Group is passing through." As Sergeant Cooper stepped away to make the call, the other two airmen approached, drawn by the unfolding story. Colonel Mitchell made introductions, and within minutes, James found himself at the center of a small, rapt audience as he reluctantly shared sanitized versions of missions that had long ago been declassified. "We didn't have the technology you all have today," he explained, warming to the subject despite himself. "No GPS, no satellite phones, certainly no drones providing overwatch when we went behind enemy lines. We were truly on our own until extraction. That's what makes the Plymouth operation so remarkable," Colonel Mitchell added. "Your team established contact protocols that we still teach today. The fundamental principles haven't changed, even if the technology has." James looked at her with genuine curiosity. "What parts of those operations are still relevant?" "It was primitive compared to what you have now, the human elements," she replied without hesitation. "Technology fails. Batteries die. Signals get jammed. When everything goes dark, it's the human protocols that keep operators alive. How to establish contact when primary communications are compromised. How to verify friendly forces without electronic confirmation. How to coordinate extraction under duress. These fundamentals haven't changed since your team codified them." The diner door opened, and an older man with a military bearing despite his civilian clothes entered, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto James. For a moment, the two Vietnam veterans simply stared at each other across decades of shared history and separate lives. "Jimmy Harrington," Thomas Cooper said, his voice gruff with emotion. "They told me you were dead." James stood slowly, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated, Tommy." The two men embraced, a half-century of unspoken experiences contained in that simple gesture. When they separated, both had suspiciously bright eyes. "Sir," Sergeant Cooper said to his grandfather, "you never told me you served with someone who received the Silver Star." Thomas Cooper shook his head. "There are a lot of things I never told you, Jason. Some because they were classified, most because they were better left in the past." He turned to James. "But seeing you here, alive and well, that's something I never expected." As Thomas settled into the booth beside James, Colonel Mitchell discreetly signaled to Tiffany for More coffee. The waitress, now watching the unfolding scene with undisguised fascination, hurried to bring a fresh pot and additional cups. I heard you got hit near Da Nang in '72. James said to Thomas after I rotated back to the States. Thomas nodded. Took some shrapnel in the leg. Nothing compared to what you went through at Plymouth. You remember that day? James asked quietly. Remember it, Jimmy? I still dream about it sometimes, Thomas replied, his voice dropping. For days behind enemy lines, radio damaged in the initial contact, half the team wounded. And you still completed the mission and got everyone out alive. When they pinned that silver star on you, it wasn't nearly enough for what you did. The younger airmen listened with rapt attention, witnessing a side of military history rarely accessible to them. The personal connections and human stories behind the operational reports they studied. Colonel Mitchell observed with quiet satisfaction as the natural bond of shared service bridged generations in the small diner booth. Tiffany approached hesitantly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but my manager asked if he could take a photo for the diner wall, if that's okay. She gestured to a wall near the entrance where framed photographs of local veterans were displayed. He said it would be an honor to add Mr. Harrington and Mr. Cooper. James and Thomas exchanged glances, decades of practiced privacy warring. With the unexpected recognition of their service, it was Thomas who finally nodded. I think it's about time we stopped hiding in plain sight. Jimmy, what do you say? Before James could answer, the diner door opened again, and an older gentleman in his 60s hurried in, making a beeline for their table. Lieutenant Harrington, he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. It really is you? James looked up, confusion clear on his face until recognition dawned. Martinez, Carlos Martinez. Yes, sir, the man confirmed, breaking into a wide smile. I was having coffee across the street when Jason called his father, who called me. I couldn't believe it. Martinez was our point man, James explained, to Colonel Mitchell and the younger airmen. Best tracker in the entire group. 3 Purple Hearts by the time I finished my second tour. Martinez added with a self-deprecating shrug. Never could learn to duck fast enough. As Martinez joined the growing reunion, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. Other patrons, initially curious about the gathering around the booth, began to approach as word spread about who these unassuming older men were. A Vietnam-era Marine introduced himself, followed by a Gulf War veteran who wanted to shake their hands. An active-duty Army sergeant from the local recruiting office arrived, having heard through the informal veterans network that something remarkable was happening at the Sunshine Diner. James, who had spent decades avoiding attention, found himself at the center of a growing gathering of veterans from multiple generations, each eager to connect with living history. What began as a simple cup of coffee had transformed into an impromptu reunion, spanning 50 years of American military service. Colonel Mitchell watched with satisfaction as James gradually relaxed into the role that circumstances had thrust upon him. The quiet, reserved veteran began sharing stories he had kept bottled up for decades, finding an appreciative audience in both his contemporaries and the younger generation of service members. You know what the hardest part was? James was saying to a small group that included both Vietnam veterans and active duty personnel. Coming home to a country that either vilified us or wanted to pretend we didn't exist. We didn't expect parades, but we didn't expect to be treated like criminals either. An Iraq War veteran nodded in understanding. Different war, different reception, but I get it. The disconnect between what you experienced and what civilians think you experienced. That gap never really closes. That's why gatherings like this matter, Colonel Mitchell interjected, the unbroken line of service, the shared understanding that transcends the specific conflicts. This is the true meaning of the warrior's brotherhood and sisterhood, she added with a small smile. Tiffany, who had been watching the growing assembly with increasing amazement, approached Colonel Mitchell. I had no idea, she said quietly, about any of this, about him. She nodded toward James, who was deep in conversation with Thomas. And Martinez, most people don't, Colonel Mitchell replied. That's partially by design. Men like James Harrington weren't trained to seek recognition. But it's also because society often finds it easier to simplify complex conflicts. and the warriors who fought in them. I feel terrible about how I treated him," Tiffany admitted. "Then learn from it," the colonel suggested gently. "Not just about Mr. Harrington specifically, but about making assumptions based on appearances. That quiet elderly person might have saved lives in combat. That homeless veteran might have once commanded troops in battle. The man with PTSD symptoms might have earned multiple decorations for valor." Tiffany nodded thoughtfully. "I will," she promised, "and I'll make sure everyone who works here knows about Mr. Harrington and the others on our wall." She gestured to the veterans' photo display. Their stories should be remembered. As the morning progressed, James found himself engaged in conversation with Staff Sergeant Cooper, the grandson of his former radio operator. The young airman was full of questions about his grandfather's service, questions that Thomas had never been willing to answer. "He never told me about me," the sergeant said. "Never mentioned that he saved your life." James glanced at Thomas, who nodded his permission to share the story. "Your grandfather didn't just save my life," James explained. "He saved our entire team. We were compromised, surrounded, with wounded men who couldn't move quickly. Our primary radio was damaged in the initial contact, and our backup had limited range." He paused, the memories vivid despite the decades. "Your grandfather jury-rigged a signal booster using parts from damaged equipment, climbed a tree in the middle of a firefight to get better reception, and maintained contact with our extraction team while taking fire from 3 directions." Staff Sergeant Cooper stared at his grandfather with new understanding. "You never told me any of this." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It wasn't relevant to your life. Just did what needed doing. But it is relevant," Colonel Mitchell interjected, "because the principles your grandfather applied. Adapting to equipment failure, improvising solutions, maintaining communication discipline under extreme duress. These are foundational skills that your grandson now trains in with much more sophisticated equipment. The technology changes, but the core competencies remain the same." James nodded in agreement. "There's a direct line from what we learned through trial and error to the protocols that protect today's operators, knowing our experiences weren't wasted, that they're still saving lives. That matters." As James spoke, Colonel Mitchell observed a subtle but significant transformation. The man who had entered the diner hunched and trying to remain invisible was now sitting straight, speaking with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, in being recognized, in connecting his past service to present military operations. James Harrington was reclaiming a part of himself that had been buried for decades. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering that had transformed the Sunshine Diner into an impromptu veterans hall. What had begun as a chance encounter between a forgotten warrior and a recognizing officer had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. The diner's owner, Dan, had arrived an hour earlier, immediately closing the establishment to regular business when he realized what was happening, placing a handwritten sign on the door that simply read "Private Event, Veterans Reunion." "You didn't have to do that," James had protested when he saw the sign. "You're losing business." Dan, a stocky man in his 50s with the firm handshake of someone who understood hard work, had simply shaken his head. "Some things are more important than a few hours of business, Lieutenant Harrington. My father would have my hide if I did anything less." Now, tables had been pushed together to accommodate the growing assembly of veterans and active duty personnel. Coffee flowed freely, and Dan had fired up the grill again, refusing payment from anyone in uniform or wearing a veteran's cap. The diner had become a living museum of American military history, with representatives spanning conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan sharing stories, finding unexpected connections, and bridging generations of service. Colonel Mitchell stood near the counter, watching with satisfaction as James Harrington held court at the center table, his initial reluctance replaced by a measured engagement that spoke to his natural leadership abilities. She noticed how the younger service members leaned in when he spoke, absorbing not just his words, but the weight of experience behind them. "You planned this, didn't you?" a voice beside her asked. She turned to find Thomas Cooper, James's former radio operator, regarding her with knowing eyes. Not exactly, she admitted, but when opportunities present themselves, good officers adapt and execute. Thomas nodded approvingly. That's what made Jimmy such a good officer. He could read a situation and adapt faster than anyone I ever served. He gestured toward his former lieutenant. Look at him now. 50 years of keeping to himself, and in a few hours, you've got him teaching again. Colonel Mitchell followed his gaze. James was describing tactical considerations to a small group that included both Vietnam veterans and active duty personnel, his weathered hands moving with precision as he mapped out positions on the table using salt, shakers, and condiment bottles. He's not just teaching, she observed. He's connecting his experiences to theirs, showing how the fundamentals remain constant across decades and different conflicts. That's the real value here, Thomas agreed. These kids with their drones and satellite comms, they need to understand that when the technology fails, and it always does eventually, it comes down to the same basics we dealt with: how to move, communicate, and survive when everything goes sideways. Across the diner, Tiffany had undergone her own transformation. The waitress who had rolled her eyes at James hours earlier was now moving efficiently between tables, serving coffee and food with a newfound respect that bordered on reverence. She paused beside James's table, refilling cups without interrupting his explanation. "Thank you, Tiffany," he said, briefly pausing his story. "No, thank you, sir," she replied with genuine sincerity. "I've learned more today than in any history class one ever took." James acknowledged her words with a nod before continuing his explanation to the assembled group. "The point is, technology changes, but terrain and human nature remain constant. The same valleys that channeled our movements in '71 dictated operational parameters for units in Afghanistan 30 years later." A young Army lieutenant nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what our instructors emphasized at Benning. Study the history of your operational area, because the same geographic features that affected previous conflicts will affect yours." Smart instructors, James approved. We learned that lesson the hard way. At a nearby table, Staff Sergeant Cooper was engaged in animated conversation with his grandfather, decades of silence between them finally breaking down as Thomas shared stories he had never before been willing to tell. The younger Cooper was recording the conversation on his phone, preserving his family's military history for future generations. Colonel Mitchell checked her watch and approached James's table. "Mr. Harrington, I hate to interrupt, but if we're going to make our flight to Lackland, we should prepare to depart within the hour." James looked up, momentarily disoriented as he was pulled from his memories back to the present. "Of course, Colonel. I just need to collect my things from my apartment. I've taken the liberty of arranging transportation," she replied. "If you'll provide your address, we can have an airman drive you home to pack and then bring you directly to Peterson." Before James could respond, Martinez spoke up from beside him. "I can drive him, Colonel. I'd appreciate a few more minutes to catch up with my old lieutenant." Colonel Mitchell nodded her agreement. "Perfect. Meet us at Peterson's main gate at 1400 hours. I'll have a security pass waiting for you." As arrangements were finalized, Dan approached with a digital camera. "Before everyone heads out, I'd like to get a photo for the wall, if that's all right. Not just of Mr. Harrington and Mr. Cooper, but all of you together. All generations of service in one shot." There was murmured agreement, and the diverse group of veterans and active duty personnel arranged themselves behind and beside James. Thomas and Martinez, the Vietnam veterans, forming the center of the composition, surrounded by the warriors who had followed in their footsteps. Colonel Mitchell positioned herself slightly to the side, understanding instinctively that this moment was about the enlisted personnel and combat veterans more than officers. "Gentlemen and ladies," Dan said as he prepared to take the photo, "on behalf of civilians like me who sleep peacefully at night because of your sacrifices, thank you for your service, all of you, from every era." The camera flashed, capturing a moment of connection across generations that transcended the individual conflicts they had fought. Dan reviewed the image on his camera's display and nodded with satisfaction. "This is going on the wall today, and I'm sending copies to anyone who wants one." As the gathering began to disperse, each returning to their own lives enriched by the unexpected communion they had shared. James found himself standing with Colonel Mitchell near the diner entrance. "I'm still not entirely sure how this happened," he admitted, gesturing to the room where small groups still lingered in conversation. "I came in for coffee and a quiet meal before my bus trip. Sometimes recognition creates a cascade effect," she replied. "One person seeing you for who you really are opened the door for others to see it too." She paused, studying his face. "How does it feel after all these years of blending into the background?" James considered the question carefully. "Complicated," he finally answered. "Part of me still wants to retreat to my quiet life, but another part—" He glanced back at the diner where Thomas was showing his grandson photos from a worn wallet. "Another part recognizes that there's value in connecting these dots, in making sure the lessons we learned aren't lost when we're gone. That's precisely why your presence at your nephew's graduation is so important," Colonel Mitchell said. "You're not just a proud family member, you're a living link to the heritage he's joining." James nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing. "I'll accept your offer of transportation, Colonel, and if you still want that historical consultant for your speech, I'd be honored to provide some perspective." Colonel Mitchell smiled. "Excellent. I was hoping you'd say that." An hour later, James stood in his modest apartment, packing a small duffel bag for the journey. Martinez waited in the living room, examining the sparse decorations with interest. Unlike many veterans, James kept no shadow boxes of medals, no framed commendations on his walls. His service memorabilia was confined to a single wooden box on a high shelf in his bedroom closet. After a moment's hesitation, James pulled down the box and opened it. Inside lay his Silver Star, Purple Heart, and various campaign medals, untouched for decades. Beneath them was a faded photograph of his team in Vietnam. Young men with old eyes standing before a helicopter, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of determination and weariness that characterized their generation of warriors. "Taking them with you?" Martinez asked from the doorway, nodding toward the medals. "I think it's time," James replied quietly. "My nephew should know where he comes from." Martinez smiled. "The Colonel was right about you, you know. The younger generation needs these connections. They need to know they're part of something bigger than themselves, something that predates their service and will continue long after." James carefully wrapped the medals in a handkerchief and placed them in his duffel bag. "I spent so many years trying to forget, trying to move past it all. I never considered that remembering, selectively, constructively, might be the healthier path. It's a balancing act," Martinez agreed. "Some memories should stay buried, but the lessons, the brotherhood, the heritage, those are worth preserving." When they arrived at Peterson Space Force Base, Colonel Mitchell was waiting at the security checkpoint as promised. James was processed through with efficiency, receiving a visitor's badge with Distinguished Visitor printed below his name. The designation caused him to raise an eyebrow at the colonel, who merely smiled in response. "Your transportation awaits." "Gentlemen," she said, leading them to a waiting staff car, "our flight departs in 40 minutes. As they drove across the sprawling base, James observed the modern military installation with interest. The technologies and facilities had advanced dramatically since his day, but the purpose remained constant: to train, equip, and support America's warfighters. They arrived at a small hangar, where a sleek C-1A Learjet sat on the tarmac, its engines being prepared for departure. A young Air Force captain approached as they exited the vehicle. "Colonel Mitchell," he said with a crisp salute, "we're ready for pre-flight briefing whenever you are. We've filed a direct flight plan to Lackland as requested." "Thank you, Captain Reynolds," she replied, returning his salute. "This is Lieutenant James Harrington, retired, and Mr. Carlos Martinez. They'll be accompanying us to Lackland." The captain's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Lieutenant Harrington from Plymouth. It's an honor, sir. We studied your extraction protocol at the academy." James blinked in surprise. "You studied Operational History 310, sir," the captain explained. "Precedent-setting special operations from Korea to Desert Storm. Your team's extraction under fire is a case study in the third semester curriculum. Colonel Mitchell suppressed a smile at James's stunned expression. I told you your work was foundational, Mr. Harrington. Captain Reynolds is just one of thousands of officers who've studied your operations. As they boarded the aircraft, James found himself seated in a comfortable leather chair far removed from the bus seat he had expected to occupy for his journey. Martinez settled across from him, his expression reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and appreciation. I never imagined traveling like this, Martinez commented quietly. From jungle patrols to executive jets, life takes strange turns. Indeed it does, James agreed, gazing out the window as ground crew completed their preparations. Though I suspect this particular turn has more to do with Colonel Mitchell's intervention than any natural progression. The colonel joined them after completing her pre-flight briefing with the pilots. We'll be arriving at Lackland in approximately 2 hours, she informed them. I've taken the liberty of arranging accommodations for you in the distinguished visitors' quarters. Mr. Harrington, Mr. Martinez, would you like us to arrange lodging for you as well? Martinez shook his head. Thank you, Colonel, but I have family in San Antonio. I'll stay with them and meet up with Jimmy at the graduation tomorrow. As the jet taxied toward the runway, James gazed out the window at the Rocky Mountains rising majestically in the distance. Just this morning, he had been an anonymous veteran preparing for an uncomfortable bus journey. Now he was flying in an executive military aircraft, his contributions recognized and valued by a new generation of warriors. Something on your mind, Mr. Harrington? Colonel Mitchell asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Just reflecting on how quickly life can change course, he replied, and wondering what my nephew will make of all this. He knows I served, but not much beyond that. I've never been one to talk about it. How will you explain arriving on a military jet with an Air Force colonel instead of a Greyhound bus? Martinez asked with a grin. James chuckled. I'm still working on that part. The truth often works best, Colonel Mitchell suggested. That your service created a legacy that continues to influence military operations today, and that the recognition of that fact led to today's events. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the clear Colorado sky. As they climbed to cruising altitude, a young airman approached with a satellite phone. Excuse me, sir, he said to James, there's a call for you from Master Sergeant Williams at Lackland. James accepted the phone with a questioning glance at Colonel Mitchell, who merely smiled enigmatically. This is James Harrington, he said into the receiver. Lieutenant Harrington. A deep voice responded. Master Sergeant Deacon Williams, 326th Training Squadron. Colonel Mitchell informed us of your arrival for tomorrow's graduation ceremony. Yes, my nephew Michael Harrington is graduating with your squadron, James confirmed. Indeed he is, sir, the Master Sergeant replied. What Colonel Mitchell may not have mentioned is that your nephew has been selected as honor graduate for his flight, top performer in all categories. James felt a surge of pride. He didn't tell me that. They're not permitted communication during the final phase of training, sir. But there's something else you should know. During his leadership assessment, he cited his motivation for excellence as, and I quote, living up to the standards set by my uncle, a Vietnam veteran who never speaks about his service, but whose quiet strength has always guided me. James found himself momentarily speechless, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. Sir, with your permission, the Master Sergeant continued, we would like you to participate in the ceremony tomorrow. Traditionally, significant family members of the honor graduate are invited to place the honor graduate distinction on their uniform. During the ceremony, I would be honored, James managed, his voice slightly rough. Excellent, sir. We'll send a car to bring you to the rehearsal tomorrow morning. And sir, speaking personally, as someone who has studied the history of special operations, it's an honor to have you attending our graduation. After the call concluded, James sat in silence for several moments, processing this new information. Colonel Mitchell and Martinez respectfully gave him space, understanding the emotional impact of what he had just learned. My nephew never knew the details of my service, James finally said. I never spoke about it, never wore my medals, never called attention to it. Yet somehow, he still felt its influence. He shook his head in wonder, all these years of silence, thinking I was protecting him from the darker aspects of war, and instead, he was finding inspiration in what little he could see. Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for, Martinez observed. They see the character shaped by experience, even when they don't know the experiences themselves. Colonel Mitchell nodded in agreement. The quiet dignity and strength that comes from having faced the worst and survived, those qualities don't need explanation to be recognized and respected. As the aircraft cruised southward, James's thoughts turned to his nephew, a young man he had always loved but kept at a certain emotional distance, part of his general tendency toward isolation born from his wartime experiences. The realization that Michael had found inspiration in his silence, that his nephew had strived for excellence partly to honor a heritage he only dimly understood, shifted something fundamental in James's perspective. I've been doing him a disservice, he said, quietly. By keeping my experiences locked away, I've denied him access to his own family's history. 2 lessons that might have value for his own service. It's not too late to change that. Colonel Mitchell pointed out, tomorrow's ceremony offers a perfect opportunity to begin building that bridge. James nodded, his decision made. Yes, it does, and I think it's time I crossed it. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Lackland Air Force Base. As James Harrington stood before the mirror in his distinguished visitor's quarters, adjusting the tie he had hastily purchased the previous evening, the reflection that gazed back at him bore little resemblance to the hunched figure who had entered the Sunshine Diner just 24 hours earlier. His shoulders were squared, his posture straight but not rigid, his eyes clear and focused. After decades of trying to fade into the background, he was deliberately making himself visible. On the desk beside him lay the wooden box containing his medals, open and waiting. After a moment's consideration, he lifted the silver star and pinned it to his lapel, not out of vanity, but as a silent acknowledgement of the heritage he was finally ready to share with his nephew. The Purple Heart and other decorations would remain in the box. Some honors were too personal, too deeply connected to painful memories, to display casually. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Colonel Mitchell, resplendent in her formal dress uniform with its impressive array of ribbons and medals. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington." She greeted him. "The car will be here in 15 minutes to take us to the ceremony." "Thank you, Colonel," he replied, gesturing to his silver star. "Is this appropriate? I don't want to overstep or draw undue attention." She smiled approvingly. "It's entirely appropriate. You earned that medal in service to your country, and wearing it honors not just your own sacrifice, but the sacrifices of those who served alongside you." She paused, studying his expression. "How did you sleep?" "Surprisingly well," James admitted. "Better than I have in years, actually. There's something liberating about being recognized after so long in the shadows. Recognition is a powerful force," Colonel Mitchell observed. "It validates experiences that might otherwise feel isolated or forgotten. That's why today matters so much, not just for your nephew, but for you as well." The drive to the parade grounds took them past rows of identical dormitories, where recruits were transformed into airmen. Through the rigorous process of basic military training, James watched the precisely maintained grounds pass by, noting the similarities and differences from his own training half a century earlier. "The superficial elements change," Colonel Mitchell commented, following his gaze. "The uniforms evolve, the facilities modernize, the technology advances, but the core purpose remains constant: to forge individuals into teams capable of executing the mission under any conditions." "Some things never change," James agreed. "The need for discipline, for attention to detail, for unwavering commitment to your fellow service members." They arrived at the parade grounds where bleachers had been erected to accommodate the hundreds of family members gathered to celebrate this milestone in their loved ones' lives. The graduating flights stood in perfect formation on the field, their uniforms immaculate, their posture rigid as they awaited the ceremony's commencement. James was escorted to a reserved seat in the front row, with Colonel Mitchell beside him. On his other side sat Carlos Martinez, who had arrived early to secure their places. Behind them, to James's surprise, sat Thomas Cooper and his grandson, Staff Sergeant Cooper, who had flown in that morning specifically for the ceremony. "Wouldn't miss it, Jimmy," Thomas said simply when James expressed his astonishment. 50 years is too long between team reunions. Before James could respond, the ceremony began with the arrival of the base commander and distinguished guests. Colonel Mitchell excused herself to join the official party on the reviewing stand, her role as guest speaker requiring her presence among the senior leadership. The ceremony proceeded with military precision, the national anthem, the posting of colors, the formal inspection of the graduating flights. James watched with growing anticipation, his eyes scanning the formations until he located his nephew. Michael Harrington stood at the front of his flight, his posture perfect, his expression solemn with the weight of the moment. When the time came for the recognition of honor graduates, the base commander's voice rang out over the parade ground. Trainee Michael Harrington, front and center. James watched with undisguised pride as his nephew marched crisply to the center of the field, his movements reflecting weeks of intensive training. Trainee Harrington has distinguished himself as the honor graduate of Flight 422, the commander announced, demonstrating exceptional performance in all aspects of training. He embodies the core values of the United States Air Force: integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. The Master Sergeant, who had called James on the aircraft, stepped forward. "As is our tradition, we invite Trainee Harrington's family to participate in this recognition. I am honored to announce that with us today is his uncle, Lieutenant James Harrington, Silver Star recipient and veteran of the 5th Special Forces Group." A murmur passed through the crowd as James rose from his seat. Surprised by the formal acknowledgement, he had expected to participate, but not to be introduced with his rank and decorations. "Lieutenant Harrington," the Master Sergeant continued, "would you please join your nephew on the field?" With a steadying breath, James walked onto the parade ground, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes following his progress. He approached his nephew, who maintained his position of attention despite the obvious shock in his eyes at hearing his uncle's military credentials announced so publicly. The Master Sergeant handed James a small case containing the honor graduate distinction. "Sir, would you do the honors?" James stood before his nephew, their eyes meeting in a moment of profound connection. "Michael," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest, "I am so incredibly proud of you." He carefully pinned the distinction to his nephew's uniform, his weathered hands steady from decades of self-discipline. As he stepped back and rendered a precise salute, muscle memory from years of service returning without conscious thought, he saw tears glistening in Michael's eyes. Though the young man's posture never faltered, Michael returned the salute with perfect form. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When James returned to his seat, Thomas gripped his shoulders silently, a gesture that communicated more than words ever could between men of their generation. Martinez nodded approvingly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The ceremony continued with Colonel Mitchell's address. She stepped to the podium with the confident bearing of a senior officer, accustomed to public speaking, distinguished guests, base leadership, and most importantly, graduates and families. She began, "Today marks not just the completion of basic military training, but your formal induction into a heritage that spans generations of service and sacrifice." Her gaze swept across the formations before settling briefly on James. "I am reminded today of the unbroken line that connects all who serve, from the pioneers, who established the traditions and tactics we now take for granted, to each of you who will carry those traditions forward into future challenges." She continued with a powerful address about the nature of service, the importance of heritage, and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Throughout her speech, she wove in references to the foundations laid by previous generations, speaking eloquently about how the lessons learned in earlier conflicts had shaped the modern military's approach to training, tactics, and leadership. "Yesterday," she said, her voice carrying across the silent parade ground, "I had the privilege of speaking with veterans whose service dates back to Vietnam. Men who operated with primitive equipment by today's standards, who faced adversity with nothing but their training, their courage, and their commitment to their teammates. The tactics they developed through trial and error, often at great personal cost, are now foundational elements of your training. She paused, her expression solemn. When you find yourself tested, and you will be tested, remember that you stand on the shoulders of those who came before you. Their hard-won wisdom flows through the veins of our institutional knowledge, and their sacrifice has paved the way for your service. As Colonel Mitchell concluded her address, James found himself deeply moved by her skillful connection of past to present, the way she had honored the contributions of his generation while empowering the newest members of the armed forces. There was no patronizing nostalgia in her words, only respectful acknowledgement of the continuum of service that bound them all together. Following the ceremony, families flooded the field to congratulate the graduates. James found himself surrounded by his small but significant support group as they waited for Michael to join them. The young airman approached cautiously, his expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty as he faced the uncle, whose military background had been, until today, largely unknown to him. "Uncle James," he said, coming to attention and saluting. "Once more, I had no idea about any of it." James returned the salute before pulling his nephew into a firm embrace. "That was my doing, Michael, for too many years. I kept that part of myself locked away." He stepped back, his hands on his nephew's shoulders. "But seeing you today, carrying forward the tradition of service in your own way, I couldn't be prouder." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Michael asked, the question without accusation, only genuine curiosity. James considered his answer carefully. "Vietnam was complicated. When we came home, there weren't ceremonies like this. No one wanted to hear about what we'd done or why we'd done it. After a while, it became easier to keep those experiences private." He glanced at Thomas and Martinez. "But I'm learning that some stories are worth telling, especially to those who are following a similar path." Colonel Mitchell joined their group, accepting Michael's crisp salute with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Airman Harrington. Your performance has been exemplary." "Thank you, Mum," Michael replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the presence of such senior leadership at his graduation. "Your uncle's influence seems to have served you well," she observed, even without knowing the details of his service. Michael nodded. "He never talked about Vietnam, but he taught me everything important: integrity, perseverance, putting others before yourself. I just never knew where those lessons came from." "They came from hard experience," James acknowledged. "Lessons written in blood and sacrifice that I hoped you would never have to learn the same way." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, his original set of dog tags, preserved for decades in his wooden box of memories. "I want you to have these, not as a burden, but as a reminder that you're part of something larger than yourself, something that stretches back through generations of service." Michael accepted the dog tags with reverent hands, running his fingers over the embossed information that had once identified his uncle. "In the jungles of Southeast Asia, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," James assured him. "Just know that whatever challenges you face in your service, you're not facing them alone. The wisdom of those who came before you is built into your training, your tactics, your equipment." He gestured to Thomas and Martinez. "And sometimes, that wisdom comes with faces and names and stories that might help light your way forward." As the graduates and their families began to disperse to various celebration lunches and departures, Colonel Mitchell drew James aside. "There's one more thing I didn't mention earlier," she said. "The base commander would like to invite you, Mr. Martinez, and Mr. Cooper to address the officer candidates in training here tomorrow morning. Nothing formal, just a conversation about your experiences and the lessons that might benefit future officers." James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you?" "Colonel," she smiled unapologetically, "let's just say I recognized an opportunity when I saw one. These young officers need to hear from men like you, not just about tactics and operations, but about leadership under adverse conditions, about maintaining humanity in inhumane situations." about carrying the weight of command when lives hang in the balance. I'm not sure what wisdom I have to offer that isn't already in their training manuals. James demurred. The manuals contain procedures and protocols. Colonel Mitchell replied. What they can't convey is the human element, the cost of leadership, the weight of decisions, the importance of moral courage alongside physical courage. She held his gaze steadily. That's something only those who have borne that burden can truly communicate. Before James could respond, Michael rejoined them, accompanied by several members of his flight who were eyeing James, Thomas, and Martinez with poorly disguised awe after learning of their backgrounds. Uncle James, Michael said, my friends were hoping to hear some of your stories. If you're willing, sir. James looked at the eager young faces before him, the newest generation of America's defenders, standing at the beginning of journeys whose paths and destinations they could not yet imagine. In their eyes, he saw reflections of himself and his comrades half a century earlier, young, committed, ready to serve, unaware of the challenges that awaited them. In that moment, James Harrington made a decision that completed the transformation that had begun in a small diner just 24 hours before. The time for shadows and silence had passed. These young men and women deserved to know the truths that only experience could teach, not to glorify war or elevate his own service, but to connect them to the heritage they were now part of, to prepare them for the burdens and honors that awaited them. I'd be happy to share what I can, he said, finding that he truly meant it. Not all stories are suitable for graduation day, but there are some worth telling. As they gathered under the shade of a nearby tree, James began with the story of his first command, not a tale of heroics or dramatic firefights, but an honest account of fear overcome, of mistakes made and lessons learned, of the sacred trust between a leader and those who follow. Thomas and Martinez added their perspectives, the three veterans weaving a tapestry of experience that transcended the specific conflict they had fought in, touching on universal truths about service, sacrifice, and the enduring bonds forged in adversity. Colonel Mitchell observed from a respectful distance, satisfied with the outcome of her intervention. What had begun with a waitress's dismissive eye roll had transformed into a moment of profound connection across generations of service, a reminder that recognition, properly channeled, could heal old wounds while strengthening the foundations of future service. Later that afternoon, as James and Michael walked together across the base, the younger Harrington asked a question that had been forming since the ceremony. Will you tell me more, Uncle James, about Vietnam, about what you did there? I understand if some of it is too difficult to talk about, but I want to know my family's history. James nodded slowly. Yes, I will. Not all at once, and not every detail. Some memories are mine alone to carry. But you deserve to know where you come from, the heritage you're now part of. He placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder, and perhaps in the telling, I'll finally lay down some burdens I've carried too long. As they continued their walk, James felt a weight lifting, not the burdens of memory or the cost of service, which would always be part of him, but the self-imposed isolation that had kept him separated from the community of warriors to which he had always belonged. In recognizing his nephew's achievement, he had found his own recognition, not in medals or ceremonies, but in the unbroken line of service that connected them across decades and generations. The waitress's eye roll, the colonel's intervention, the unexpected reunion with old comrades, his nephew's achievement, all had conspired to bring him full circle, from the shadows back into the light of belonging, not as a relic of a forgotten war, but as a vital link in the chain of service that stretched backward through history and forward into a future he would help shape through the sharing of hard-won wisdom. In the end, James Harrington understood that recognition wasn't about parades or public acclaim. It was about connection, to those who had served alongside you, to those who had gone before, and most importantly, to those who would carry the torch forward. His nephew would face his own challenges, write his own stories, but he would do so knowing that he was never truly alone. The wisdom of generations stood behind him, including the quiet strength of an uncle who had finally found his voice. As the sun began to set over Lackland Air Force Base, casting long shadows across grounds that had witnessed countless beginnings of military service. James felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. His journey had come full circle, not to the young lieutenant who had led men in combat, but to a man who had finally integrated all aspects of his life into a whole that could now serve a purpose beyond himself. The waitress had rolled her eyes. The colonel had changed everything, and in between those moments, James Harrington had found his way home, not to a place, but to the community of service that had always been his true belonging. Some journeys took 50 years to complete, but their conclusion was no less powerful for the time it took to reach it. In recognition, there was healing. In healing, there was wisdom. And in wisdom shared, there was hope for those who would follow in the footsteps of giants they were only beginning to understand. 3 months after the graduation ceremony at Lackland Air Force Base, the Sunshine Diner bustled with its usual morning crowd. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. As Tiffany moved efficiently between tables, her customer service transformed by the events of that fateful day. When James Harrington's legacy had been recognized, the wall of veterans photographs had expanded, now featuring a prominent display of the group photo taken during the impromptu reunion, alongside historical photos of James, Thomas, and Martinez from their Vietnam service days. The bell above the door chimed, and Tiffany looked up to see a tall woman in civilian clothes enter. Despite the absence of a uniform, Colonel Eleanor Mitchell carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a senior military officer. She surveyed the diner before approaching the counter. "Good morning, Colonel Mitchell." Tiffany greeted her with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful to see you again." "Good morning, Tiffany," the colonel replied with a smile. "Is everything prepared for today?" "Yes, ma'am. Dan has the back room set up exactly as you requested. Mr. Harrington arrived early to help with the arrangements." Tiffany gestured toward the private dining area at the rear of the establishment. "Can I get you some coffee while you wait for the others?" "That would be perfect, thank you." As Tiffany prepared the coffee, Colonel Mitchell studied the veterans' wall. The diner had become something of a local landmark in the months following the reunion. What had begun as a chance encounter had sparked a movement that extended far beyond their small circle. The story of James Harrington's recognition after decades of anonymity had spread through veteran communities across the region, inspiring similar gatherings and recognitions. Coffee in hand, Colonel Mitchell made her way to the back room, where she found James arranging folders on a conference table. At 68, he stood straighter now, his movements more purposeful, his eyes clearer and more engaged than when she had first encountered him. The transformation went beyond physical bearing. There was a vitality about him that spoke of renewed purpose. "Good morning, James." She greeted him. "Everything looks perfect." He looked up with a smile that reached his eyes, something that had been rare during their first meeting. "Eleanor, right on schedule as always." The formality of rank and title had gradually given way to first names as their professional relationship evolved into friendship. "How many are we expecting today?" she asked, surveying the arranged materials. 15 confirmed. James replied, "Veterans from Vietnam through Afghanistan, all interested in participating in the program. Thomas and Martinez are bringing 3 more from their contacts in the VFW." The program they referred to had emerged organically from the events at Lackland. What had begun as a what-I'm address to officer candidates had evolved into a structured mentorship initiative that paired experienced veterans with military personnel preparing for deployment or leadership positions. The Bridge Program, as it had come to be called, created connections across generations of service, ensuring that hard-won wisdom was not lost in the gaps between conflicts or buried in the silence of those who had carried it alone. "And Michael, will he be joining us?" Colonel Mitchell asked, referring to James's nephew who had been instrumental in the program's development. "He's flying in this afternoon," James confirmed. His commander approved 3 days of leave specifically to participate in the launch meeting. "Apparently, the program has caught the attention of some senior leadership at the Pentagon. That's putting it mildly," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "The Secretary of Defense mentioned it in his address to the Air War College last week. He called it a vital initiative." for preserving institutional knowledge that transcends formal training. Doctrines. James shook his head in wonder. From a chance encounter in a diner to recognition from the Secretary of Defense in 3 months. I still can't quite believe it. I can, Eleanor said firmly, because it addresses a need that has existed for generations, the need for wisdom to flow naturally from those who earned it to those who will need it. She paused, studying the man before her. How are you feeling about today? James considered the question thoughtfully. Ready, he finally said. For decades, I carried these experiences as a burden. Now, transforming them into lessons that might spare others some of the hardships we faced. There's a kind of redemption in that. The door opened as Thomas Cooper and Carlos Martinez arrived, accompanied by 3 older men who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of veterans. Behind them came Dan, the diner's owner, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. The conquering hero's return, Thomas announced with gruff affection. Jimmy, you remember Colonel Williams from the 173rd, Captain Reynolds from the Rangers, and Master Sergeant Diaz from 1st Recon? James greeted each man with the particular mix of respect and familiarity that existed only between those who had shared similar experiences, regardless of whether they had served together. What had begun with 3 Vietnam veterans reuniting had expanded organically as word spread through veteran communities about the initiative they were building. As they settled around the table, Colonel Mitchell observed the dynamics with satisfaction. These men, who had spent decades carrying their experiences in private, were now engaged in animated discussion about how best to structure mentorship relationships that would preserve critical knowledge while respecting the unique challenges of each generation's service. The key is keeping it personal, James was explaining. The official training manuals cover procedures and protocols, but they can't convey the human element, how it feels to make life or death decisions under pressure, how to maintain your humanity in dehumanizing situations, how to lead when you're exhausted and afraid but can't show it. Master Sergeant Diaz nodded in agreement. That's what saved my team in Fallujah. Not the tactical training, though that was essential, but the advice I got from a Gulf War veteran about managing fear in urban combat environments. Nothing in the manuals prepared me for the psychological reality of house-to-house clearing operations. That's exactly the gap we're trying to bridge, Colonel Mitchell interjected. The institutional knowledge is preserved in doctrine and training, but the human wisdom, the insights that can only come from direct experience, that's what gets lost between generations unless we deliberately preserve it. Their discussion continued as more veterans arrived, each bringing unique perspectives shaped by different conflicts and service branches. What united them was a shared recognition of the value in connecting their experiences to the challenges facing today's military personnel. By mid-morning, the room had filled with veterans ranging from their late 60s to early 30s, representing service from Vietnam through the most recent operations in the Middle East. The energy was palpable as they broke into smaller groups to refine specific aspects of the program, mentorship protocols, topic frameworks, methods for matching mentors with service members based on complementary experiences. Shortly before noon, the door opened to admit a distinguished-looking man in his 50s wearing the uniform of a 3-star general. The room fell silent as General Robert Hadley, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations for the Air Force, entered, accompanied by a small entourage. Please, as you were, he said as the veterans began to rise. I'm not here in an official capacity, at least not entirely. James approached, extending his hand. General Hadley, thank you for coming. Lieutenant Harrington, the general replied, his handshake firm. The honor is mine. My father served with the 25th Infantry Division in Vietnam. He never spoke about it until the last year of his life, when cancer forced him to confront his mortality. The wisdom he finally shared in those final months transformed my understanding of leadership in ways that all my formal military education never could. He surveyed the room, taking in the diverse assembly of veterans. What you're building here matters more than you might realize. Our most junior officers and enlisted personnel have access to technologies and capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction during Vietnam. Yet they face the same fundamental human challenges of combat, leadership, and moral decision-making, under pressure that warriors have faced throughout history. General Hadley accepted a cup of coffee and joined them at the table. I've reviewed your proposal for integrating this mentorship program with pre-deployment training. The Joint Chiefs are interested, particularly in your emphasis on preserving the human elements that don't make it into field manuals. As the general engaged with the group, the door opened again to admit a young Air Force officer in service dress uniform. James rose immediately, embracing his nephew with unconcealed pride. "Michael," he said warmly, "I thought your flight wasn't until this afternoon." "I managed to catch an earlier transport," Michael replied, his posture straightening automatically as he noticed General Hadley. He rendered a crisp salute, which the general returned before waving him to a seat. "Airman Harrington, General." Hadley acknowledged. "Your commanding officer speaks highly of your contributions to this initiative. He tells me you've been instrumental in adapting the mentorship framework to resonate with younger service members. I've just tried to bridge the communication gap, sir," Michael replied modestly, ensuring that the wisdom these veterans offer is presented in a way that connects with today's military culture. As the meeting continued, James observed his nephew with quiet satisfaction. In the months since the graduation ceremony, their relationship had deepened in ways he had never anticipated. The sharing of his experiences, carefully and selectively, had created a foundation for genuine understanding between them. Michael had embraced his role as a bridge between generations, helping to translate the experiences of Vietnam-era veterans into frameworks that resonated with contemporary military personnel. During a break in the proceedings, James stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The journey from isolation to engagement, from silence to purposeful sharing, had transformed not just his relationship with his military past, but his entire approach to life. The burden of memory, carried alone for decades, had been lightened not by forgetting, but by repurposing those experiences into wisdom that might benefit others. Colonel Mitchell joined him, respecting his contemplative silence for a moment. Before speaking, "Penny for your thoughts," James smiled. "I was just thinking about that morning in the diner. If Tiffany hadn't rolled her eyes at my request for a military discount, if you hadn't walked in at that precise moment and recognized what she couldn't see, the universe has a way of creating the collisions we need," Eleanor observed. "Though I prefer to think it was more than chance, some connections are waiting to happen. They just need a catalyst." James nodded thoughtfully. "I spent decades trying to leave Vietnam behind, to lock those experiences away where they couldn't affect my present. What I never considered was that in the right context, with the right purpose, those same experiences could become something valuable, not just for me, but for an entire new generation of service members. That's the paradox of difficult experiences," Eleanor replied. "Carried alone as memories, they're a burden. Transformed into wisdom and shared with those who need it, they become a gift." She gestured toward the diner. "That's what everyone in that room has discovered. The redemptive power of purposeful sharing." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a government vehicle from which emerged a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s, wearing a conservative suit with a Department of Veterans Affairs pin on her lapel. Dr. Catherine Blackwell, the newly appointed Director of Mental Health Services for the VA, approached with a warm smile. "Lieutenant Harrington, Colonel Mitchell," she greeted them. "Thank you for inviting me today." "Dr. Blackwell," James acknowledged. "Thank you for making the trip. Your expertise will be invaluable as we refine the psychological aspects of the program." They escorted her inside, where the planning session had evolved into a structured discussion of how to formalize the bridge program while maintaining the personal connections that were its foundation. Dr. Blackwell listened attentively before addressing the group. "What you've created here addresses a gap that the VA has struggled with for decades," she explained. "Our clinical approaches to veteran reintegration and mental health have improved dramatically, but they can't replicate the healing power of purposeful connection between those who have shared similar experiences across different eras." She opened her briefcase and distributed several documents. "I've brought a proposal for a formal partnership between your initiative, and the VA's peer support programs. We envision the Bridge program as a complement to our clinical services, creating connections that facilitate healing, while simultaneously preserving vital institutional knowledge. As the afternoon progressed, what had begun as a grassroots mentorship program expanded into a comprehensive vision for intergenerational, military wisdom sharing. General Hadley offered support from the Department of Defense. Dr. Blackwell committed resources from the VA, and veterans from multiple generations contributed insights from their unique perspectives. Throughout the discussions, James found himself continually amazed by how far things had progressed from that morning in the diner. The waitress's dismissive eye roll, meant to diminish him, had instead set in motion a chain of events that was now creating meaningful change within the institutions he had once served. As the formal meeting concluded and participants broke into smaller conversations, Tiffany approached James with an envelope. "This came for you," she said, her manner reflecting the genuine respect she now held for him. "A courier delivered it just a few minutes ago." James opened the envelope to find an official letter bearing the seal of the White House. As he read its contents, his expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Noticing his reaction, "An invitation," James replied quietly, "to speak at the National Memorial Day observance at Arlington next month." Apparently, the Secretary of Defense mentioned the Bridge program to the President, who wants to recognize it as a model for veteran reintegration and knowledge preservation. Eleanor smiled. "From invisible to speaking at Arlington in less than 6 months, that's quite a journey." "It's not about me," James said firmly. "It's about what we're building together, all of us. The recognition is meaningful only because it helps advance the mission." "And what is that mission as you see it now?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. James considered the question carefully. "To ensure that the hard lessons of warfare, paid for in blood and sacrifice, are never lost between generations, to transform individual suffering into collective wisdom, to create meaning from experiences that might otherwise remain buried in silence." He gestured toward the room where veterans of different eras were engaged in animated conversation. "To build bridges across time." As the gathering began to disperse, with commitments made and next steps clearly defined, James found himself standing once more at the counter of the Sunshine Diner. The space that had witnessed the beginning of his journey from shadows to purpose now bore physical evidence of that transformation. The wall of veterans' photographs, the reserved table where service members gathered regularly to share experiences across generations, the quiet dignity with which veterans were now greeted when they entered. Dan approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "Quite a day," he commented. "From what I hear, this program of yours is going to change a lot of lives." "It already has," James acknowledged. "Starting with mine." The diner owner nodded toward the White House letter that James still held. "Arlington, huh? That's a long way from hiding in the corner booth." James smiled at the observation. The distance isn't measured in miles. As James prepared to leave, Michael joined him, their matching postures reflecting the military bearing that now visibly connected them across generations. "Uncle James," the young airman said, "I've been thinking about what happens next, after the Arlington ceremony, after the program becomes formalized within the Dodge structure." "What do you have in mind?" James asked, recognizing the thoughtful expression that meant his nephew was developing a new concept. "The Bridge program is addressing the military-to-military knowledge transfer, which is vital," Michael explained. "But there's another gap that needs bridging, between those who serve and the civilian society they protect. The same principles could be applied to help civilians understand the realities of military service, and to help veterans translate their experiences into terms that civilians can relate to." James considered the suggestion with interest. "A civil-military bridge," he mused, "creating understanding in both directions." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "The waitress rolling her eyes at your service was a symptom of a larger disconnect, one that affects how veterans reintegrate, how military service is perceived, and ultimately how our society makes decisions about when and how to employ military force." As they discussed this expansion of their vision, Colonel Mitchell rejoined them. catching the thread of their conversation. That's actually been part of the concept from the beginning, she noted, not just connecting generations of warriors, but eventually rebuilding the connection between warriors and the society they serve. She gestured toward the diner's front window, where civilian life continued its ordinary pace. Most Americans will never serve in uniform. Their understanding of military service comes from movies, news clips, and political talking points. Creating authentic connections that bridge that divide could transform how our society thinks about warfare, service, and the true cost of national security decisions. As they stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, James felt the weight of the White House letter in his pocket, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The journey that had begun with a waitress's dismissive gesture had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, creating ripples that now reached the highest levels of government and promised to extend far into the future. From invisibility to national platform in 6 months, he reflected. It makes me wonder how many other veterans are out there, carrying wisdom that could benefit others if only the right connection were made. That's the beauty of what we're building, Eleanor replied. Every connection creates the possibility for more connections. Every bridge built makes it easier to build the next one. As they parted ways, each heading towards separate responsibilities in their shared mission, James paused for a moment to look back at the Sunshine Diner, the unlikely birthplace of a movement that was already transforming lives and institutions. The waitress had rolled her eyes, the colonel had changed everything, and in between those moments, something profound had awakened, not just in James Harrington, but in every life his newly shared wisdom had touched. The redemptive power of recognition had set in motion a cascade of connections that promised to preserve hard-won wisdom for generations to come. In that simple truth lay the ultimate lesson. No experience, however painful, was wasted when it could be transformed into wisdom that served others, and no veteran, however forgotten, was truly invisible when the right eyes looked with recognition at the silent markers of their service. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.